In the gloomy caverns of a Norwegian burial chamber, a beautiful, lonesome wooden vessel was laid to rest under the dim illumination of flickering torchlight. Dazzling art and golden ornaments assembled around him. The illustrious Norse noble was set down into his casket, elevated in prime position upon the gorgeous Longship. In a way, it was the last time he would ever board his beloved ship, which would carry him into the Viking afterlife. Fortunately, he was not alone. 15 of his staunch horses and 2 loyal household dogs had joined him in this journey, as well as his battle plunderings, tribal rewards, and gifts from even his enemies. As the torch's animal wax burned down to the final drops, the grotto was plunged into ultimate darkness, leaving the Oseberg king and his breathtaking decorations to decay, unseen by human eyes. In reality, it was not 1, but 2 nobles who were hidden away in the damp burial mound of Oseberg in Norway. Women, too, one aged in her 50s, her companion well-aged in her 80s. They had been buried in a vessel that has practically become a stereotype of medieval Norse culture: the famous Longship. What makes the story of the Longship so compelling is not the naval technology itself, but the remarkable way in which it was used by Vikings to rule the waves of medieval Europe. From the North Sea to the Mediterranean, and even as far as Siberia and North Africa. The seeds for the evolution of the Viking Longship were sown way earlier than one would expect, hundreds or even thousands of years before those first Norse raiders trod foot on the beaches of Francia and the British Isles. As the story goes, ancient Scandinavians masterminded the very first ancestors of the famous Longship. Burial scenes carbon dated to as far back as the 4th millennium BC portray primeval ships sailing away into the waves, carrying crude stick figures and antiquated shields. We know longship-like boats were used as far back as the Stone Age. Tribes such as the Inuit and Yupik used slim, low-lying vessels sewn from animal skins. Evidence of their usage has been confirmed in Siberia, Greenland, and prominent Scandinavian regions. Of course, while the Viking Longship was the archetype of northern ship design and explorative ingenuity, it wasn't the first of its kind. Prior to the advent of the Longship in European waters, a class of Danish boat dominated the Hjortspring design. After a paragon of its time was uncovered in the Hjortspring Moss, it was employed to roam the North Sea. This particular boat transported small groups of raiders down river passages inland, where foot travel would have been unsuitable. Experts estimate that the ship was built around 350 BC. Longships rose to prominence in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, at which point in time the Vikings appeared on the scene of medieval Europe and made their mark on history. Hundreds of years later, in medieval chronicles and Icelandic sagas, longships featured prominently as a key element in any tale of Norse raiding. As Vikings forsook the traditional stay-at-home ways of their ancestors and neighbors, Venturing further than the mellow river passages of their home regions, raids became increasingly frequent on European shores. It was the first of these raids that grabbed the attention of those prominent in the early medieval hierarchy. The Vikings used their supremacy in shipbuilding to reach targets faster than any mainland vessel, and they targeted vulnerable coastal positions. Lindisfarne, often cited as the location where the Viking Age began, was one such undefended target that fell victim to the wrath of the Longships' Viking sailors, who raided the church, stealing huge numbers of precious relics, hauling away piles of gold, and killing innumerable monks. Without the mobility and versatility of the Longship, it's unlikely that those Norsemen would have made the journey across the North Sea and into the Kingdom of Northumbria. Monasteries were typically isolated from settlements and situated in coastal regions that were accessible by beaches. With their specially built longships, the Vikings could get further into the sands than the average trading vessel, easily disembark, and return to their carriers after the often murderous deed was done. The word impressive doesn't do any justice to the magnificent Viking longship. The townspeople and coastal guards of Christian Europe were unlikely not to tremble at the harrowing sight of those dread-inspiring sails on the horizon. Similar raids to Lindisfarne were recorded all across northern England and Ireland, and the continued refinement of Norse naval raiding strategies culminated in the tumultuous siege of Paris in 845 AD. At the delta of the river Seine, in the Kingdom of West Francia, a significant fleet of longships, led by a figure commonly identified with Ragnar Lothbrok, faced off against Charles the Bald's army. After showing the Frankish king what they were made of, the Norse invaders made their way down the Seine in their longships, pillaging and looting all the way across Francia and into Paris, which they also took great pleasure in raiding. Such an attack was not an uncommon strategy, quintessential of the Vikings' raiding culture, one might say. By the 11th century, the evolution of the iconic longship had reached its pinnacle. Longships were built in the clinker practice by overlaying molded planks of wood and packing gaps with animal hair, wood, sticks, and other refuse. Thanks to their innovative design, these vessels were remarkably durable and lightweight. As it lay low in the water, a Viking longship could achieve speeds upwards of 15 knots and effortlessly tackle hairpin turns. This made up for their lack of ramming power in bulk when compared to the capabilities of other medieval ships. But it wasn't naval battles that longships were engineered for. Instead, it was mobility and practicality. Longships could target virtually anywhere that had a beach or navigable water passage. Viking raiders could penetrate miles inland in just a few hours and ambush their enemies from the inside out, making the longship a fundamental ingredient in any Viking raiding strategy. Similar attacks were recorded along numerous waterways, notably the Rhine, Seine, and Thames. Frustratingly, there was no realistic way a medieval European army could guard against an incursion by Norse longships. Always within sight, but just out of reach, these treacherous longships were key in the pillaging of Europe by Norsemen during the early Middle Ages. Although much of the success of the Viking longship was thanks to its clever construction, long journeys in foreign oceans would not have been possible without the thick tar coverings used to insulate and protect the boats. In recent years, archaeologists have dug up an astounding number of tar-making pits, dating to the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. These were probably used to burn pine and other ingredients to produce a primitive form of tar that made the Norsemen's longship so formidable in all weather conditions. To a Viking leader, his longship was an important and prized possession. Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson narrated tales of revered Viking longships with names like the Long Serpent, Dragon Ship, and Bison. The impressions we get about longships from Old Norse sagas and medieval chronicles provide an eye-opening perspective into Viking culture. Ships were not considered mere means of transport. They were vessels that carried young Viking men to their destinies, which they believed lay just over the horizon in the lands which they would rightfully pillage throughout the early Middle Ages. It's easy to think of the Vikings as malicious, selfish marauders, but that's not the full story. In addition to raiding, they actively engaged in trade with other Europeans, bringing many tons of foreign cargo across the North Sea. The Norse flooded European markets, exposing mainland townships to exotic goods for the first time in the Middle Ages. It was not uncommon in the 10th and 11th centuries to see rows of longships drawn up on the shores of Europe's most prominent Baltic port towns. But the Norse were not strangers to farther waters either. By the turn of the first millennium, small bands of Vikings had arrived in some northern stretches of America, which they called Vinland, Leif Erikson being the leader of one of these parties. Thanks to our understanding of ocean currents and longship sailing, plus some handy remains of North American Viking houses, we've been able to trace the routes they took. If we're to believe the Icelandic chronicles, voyages to Vinland continued for at least another century after Leif Erikson's group. These voyages shaped and revolutionized the design of the longship, turning it into a formidable, ingenious piece of technology that could tackle the harshest of waves and travel hundreds of miles with ease. The Vikings owed their success not to weapons, armor, strategy, or military prowess, but to their ability to repeatedly assault any target they could dream of, again and again, wearing down the morale of its defenders and disappearing across the horizon when the situation turned against them. Without the longship, those Norse travelers, traders, and raiders would not have come close to making the legacy they have left upon history today. From the icy northern coasts of Siberia to the blistering sands of North Africa and the sunny, windswept plains of Anatolia, longships carried the Vikings across the medieval world.